Alexandra Kollontai was a revolutionary thinker and political figure who tirelessly fought for the emancipation of women, children, and workers. When the October Revolution gave her the power to implement her ideals into practice, she changed Russia forever by strengthening the power of working women. She became the first woman cabinet member in world history, negotiated peace treaties, and de-escalated wars between nations. Her socialist-feminist vision for the future sought to not only radically transform class and family relations, but the overall morality of society. Her most important contribution has been the lasting impact she has made on working-class consciousness through the generations, shaping its ability to envision and struggle for not only worker liberation from capital, but liberation from the all-encompassing bourgeois morality of capitalist society itself. This is the intellectual biography of a great thinker, leader, and revolutionary, Alexandra Kollontai. Alexandra Mikhailova Domontovich was born on March 31, 1872. As a young girl, she was referred to as Shura and showed great intellectual promise, cultivating a range of dialects from French, English, German, Bulgarian, and Finnish at a very young age. Much of her home education was under the direction of a private governess, who Kollontai describes as a very competent teacher who taught her the injustices of social inequality. As her later autobiography reflects, "Already as a small child, I criticized the injustice of adults, and I experienced as a blatant contradiction the fact that everything was offered to me, whereas so much was denied to other children. My criticism sharpened as the years went by, and the feeling of revolt against the many proofs of love around me grew apace." Her father, General Mikhail Alexeyevich Domontovich, was a Ukrainian cavalry officer and constitutional monarchist who shared an interest in politics and history with the young Alexandra. At the young age of only 6, she accompanied her father on a diplomatic trip to the newly liberated city of Taravo in Bulgaria, where she gained her first exposure to political struggle and social change. Her mother, who Alexandra was named after, was the daughter of a wealthy peasant, and left an arranged marriage in her youth to be with Alexandra's father. Her mother's unorthodox marriage may have suggested resistance to prevailing social conventions, but at home she enforced strict domestic discipline, demanding that Alexandra be neat and tidy and pursue a future husband with wealth and status comparable to the family. When Alexandra expressed interest in higher education, her mother opposed the idea, worried that such a pursuit would lead her into the wrong crowd. But Alexandra defied her mother's vision and often rebelled in the pursuit to shape her own life. She wanted to continue learning and sought a marriage based in love rather than mere financial concerns. In 1890, Alexandra met her cousin and future husband, Vladimir Ludvigovich Kollontai, an engineering student at the Military Institute. The two fell in love and became engaged shortly after. Her mother deeply objected to the marriage on financial grounds, claiming that his modest income could not support a family. But Alexandra countered, claiming that she would find work to supplement the couple's income. Her mother scoffed at the idea. "You work? You who can't even make up your own bed to look neat and tidy? You who never picked up a needle? You who go marching through the house like a princess and never help the servants with their work? You who are just like your father, going around dreaming and leaving your books on every chair and table in the house." Despite her parents' best efforts to distract their daughter by sending her on a trip to Europe, she and Vladimir remained committed to each other, married in 1893, and had a child named Mikhail. This is also when she took on the surname Kollontai, which would last for the remainder of her life. In 1896, Kollontai accompanied her husband on a job involving the installation of a factory ventilation system. This is where she witnessed the exploitation of the capitalist system firsthand. The factory air was speckled with textile fibers, which the workers inhaled daily throughout their 18-hour shifts. She spoke to some of the laborers, who told her about the high mortality rate among the workers, as well as the run-down living quarters where children cared for one another while the parents were at work. The whole ordeal deeply moved her, As she told an American war correspondent, her experience in the factory made such a profound impression on me that it changed my whole life. Kollontai's confrontation with these wretched conditions contributed to her growing consciousness surrounding the treatment of workers, the poor, and women in Tsarist Russia. To clarify her understanding of the historical and social processes behind these conditions, she immersed herself in the writings of Karl Marx and other socialist thinkers, while teaching evening classes for workers in St. Petersburg. She also began transforming her indignations into activism and was drawn into clandestine political activities. During this period, she met Elena Stasova, who employed Kollontai to transport illegal writings underground and deliver them upon utterance of a password. She became a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1899, where she first met Vladimir Lenin. She had just recently finished studying political economy at the University of Zurich, where she read Darwin and other materialist thinkers. She and Lenin were particularly drawn to the materialist philosopher and fellow Russian Social Democrat George Plekhanov. Kollontai wrote an analysis on the Finnish proletariat's relation to industry, while Lenin published an article on the Russian economic and social situation. Her and Lenin always held very similar political views, even when they were arrived at by somewhat different means. Kollontai was born into a wealthy family, but now that she had married into the working class, it is likely that she began to more directly comprehend the crisis facing the Russian proletariat. Throughout the first 28 years of her life, from 1872 to the end of the 1890s, working women took part in revolts and strikes across Russia, which saw mass destruction of factories and other capitalist property. These events greatly energized the budding revolutionary, who by her 20s could already take account of the great strides in social progress. At a time of disturbances and strikes, the woman worker, oppressed, timid, without rights, straightens up to her full height and becomes equal as a fighter and comrade. This transformation takes place unconsciously, spontaneously, but it is important and significant. It is the path along which the workers' movement is leading the woman worker to liberation, not only as one who sells her labor, but also as a woman, wife, a mother, and a housewife. As Kollontai became swept into the revolutionary struggle, she felt herself becoming torn from her husband. Kollontai was inspired by the emerging strength of women, moved by the fight for working-class power, and hopeful in the promise of a better future. But her husband's dreams and aspirations really went no further than the creation of better ventilation systems. She ultimately decided to leave her marriage and definitively respond to her revolutionary calling. She viewed her struggle not only in terms of the emancipation of women in the abstract, but made intimate connections between her political work and her own life. For it is not her specific feminine virtue that gives her a place of honor in human society, but the worth of the useful mission accomplished by her, the worth of her personality as a human being, as citizen, as thinker, as fighter. Subconsciously, this motive was the leading force of my whole life and activity, to go my own way, to work, to struggle, to create side by side with men, and to strive for the attainment of a universal human goal. But at the same time, to shape my personal, intimate life as a woman according to my own will and according to the given laws of my nature. I never let my feelings, the joy or pain of love, take the first place in my life, inasmuch as creativity, activity, struggle always occupied the foreground. On January 7, 1905, Kollontai joined a large peaceful protest in St. Petersburg. Demonstrators had gathered in opposition to the Tsar's economic policies that strained the proletariat and peasantry, as well as political reforms that curtailed ethnic minority rights, such as the right to vote. Tsarist police turned their rifles and pistols against the large crowd and indiscriminately opened fire. The police massacred hundreds of peaceful protesters on what became known as Bloody Sunday. These events made a strong mark on Kollontai's views regarding the revolutionary role of women. She saw immediately that the uprising was the moment that the Russian proletariat defined itself as a united whole and proletarian feminism came bursting onto the historic scene. The revolutionary year of 1905 sent deep shockwaves through the working masses. The Russian worker sensed his strength for the first time, that he was bearing on his shoulders the whole national wealth. The Russian proletarian woman worker, the unfailing collaborator in all the political demonstrations, was also awoken from her slumbers. The faces of women, filled with concentrated energy and unshakable resolution, can be seen among the serried ranks of the workers' procession on that memorable 9th of January Bloody Sunday. The women worker, the young girl, working wife, is a common figure among the mass victims of that January day. The Tsar sought to quell the insurrection by allowing the Russian Social Democrats to participate in the State Duma, which Kollontai referred to as a pseudo-parliament called by the Tsar in order to pacify the rebellious spirit of the age. The party split into two factions. The Mensheviks were the majority of the party, who agreed to participate in the State Duma, and the Bolsheviks were the minority, who sought to boycott the Duma. Initially, Kollontai, like many others, did not take a strong position on either side, but instead attempted to consolidate party factions around the newly formed St. Petersburg Soviets. The events of Bloody Sunday drove Kollontai to further understand the condition of women in capitalist societies. She took a particular interest to Friedrich Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, as well as Auguste Bebel's Women and Socialism. These texts provided Kollontai with the theoretical foundations to further understand how the condition of women was intricately tied to the prevailing mode of production, and how capital uniquely exploits and oppresses working women. Kollontai understood how the capitalist system exploited workers in the workplace, but wanted to further understand and demonstrate how it produced a double exploitation in women, both in the workplace and the home. Working women were frequently paid less than their husbands and bound to marriages that were dictated by economic necessity rather than mutual love and respect. Women not only worked outside the home, but within the nuclear family, domestic labor and care labor for children and the elderly were almost exclusively carried out by women. Centuries of social conventions and customs reified these practices to such an extent that certain types of labor became perceived as feminine and therefore inappropriate for men to perform. While women were busy with the domestic labor of the nuclear family, the men handled the family property and finances. Patrilineal inheritance laws determined that intergenerational wealth was passed between father to son, keeping the wealth on the men's side of the family. Thus, women did the labor in the nuclear family, and the men controlled the family property, including their wives and children. By 1907, it became clear to Kollontai that the nuclear family not only kept women chained to their husbands, but also kept women separated from each other. There was no communal setting or social structure that brought proletarian women together as a distinct community. Therefore, she and several others established the Working Women's Club and promptly launched the first International Socialist Conference of Women Workers. A new danger is threatening the domination of the bourgeoisie. Women workers are resolutely adopting the path of international class organization. The downtrodden, submissive slaves, humbly bowing before the omnipotence of the modern Moloch of capital, are under the reviving influence of socialist doctrine, lifting their heads and raising their voices in defense of their interests as women and their common class interests. To grant the woman worker the same rights as the man would be to put into the hands of the working class a new and dangerous weapon, to double the active army of the militant opponent. The bourgeoisie is too intelligent to agree to such a dangerous experiment. Kollontai always understood that the struggle to achieve political equality for proletarian women was part and parcel of the overall class struggle. Proletarian feminism was inherently social democratic and thus incompatible with bourgeois politics. She urged proletarian women against joining in alliance with bourgeois women's movements, emphasizing that proletarian women needed to fight for rights that were distinct and unique from bourgeois women. Even when bourgeois women fought for rights that might benefit proletarian women, rights that were relevant to the social and economic realities of proletarian women needed to be fought for by the proletariat alone. Unity with the bourgeoisie will only weaken the proletarian women and strengthen the bourgeoisie as a class. Therefore, unity of proletarian women meant the exclusion of bourgeois women. The suffragettes continued to base themselves on the aspirations of their own bourgeois class. The broad horizons opened up by the doctrines of social democracy, are for them alien and incomprehensible. The suffragettes are striving for equality within the framework of the existing class-based society, and without in any way encroaching upon its foundations. They are fighting for female prerogatives without striving to achieve the abolition of all existing prerogatives. The ultimate objective of the proletariat woman is the destruction of the old antagonistic class-based world and the construction of a new and better world in which the exploitation of man by man will have become impossible. Proletarian women not only face difficulties with bourgeois women, but also face challenges convincing male proletarians of the necessity to include women in building the future socialist society. The proletarian men, like the bourgeois women, stubbornly held to the antiquated customs of the dying capitalist world. However, unlike bourgeois women, who held no potential for alliance, she was determined to rescue her proletarian brothers from the old patriarchal customs through education. This, she argued, was the task of proletarian women. In order to inculcate in our comrades the proper attitude to the question of equal rights for women workers in every sphere and draw them into the struggle to attain and practice equal civil rights for women, women only have one course: to unite their forces around the party, in order to compel their comrades to wage their struggle in the interests of the female proletariat as well. Kollontai understood that in order to get these men on board with the proletarian women's movement, they would have to form a comprehensive political program. She had been in exile since 1908, but this did not prevent her from continuing on with her political struggles. In 1910, Kollontai, along with Clara Zetkin, attended the International Socialist Conference of Women Workers in Copenhagen, shortly after Denmark had announced a groundbreaking social security resolution for working women. The resolution was a policy outline that greatly inspired Kollontai's vision for social welfare programs and policies in Russia. Everyone at the conference recognized the magnitude of the achievement, and riding the wave of enthusiasm, Kollontai announced the historical significance of the moment. There is every reason to hope that the women's socialist movement, which is an integral part of the whole workers' movement, will assume larger and even more impressive dimensions. Everywhere the movement is carrying out painstaking work to involve women workers in the broad current of the whole movement. The reports made by different countries at the Women's Conference in Copenhagen is proof of this tireless activity. How this meeting of almost 100 representatives of the working class of 17 countries differed from the usual bourgeois congress of suffragettes. Her blossoming vision for a future of liberated proletarian men and women was becoming clearer in both her intellectual and political work. From 1911 to 1912, she organized and participated in strike action, anti-militarism efforts, party organizing, and protests across Europe, including Paris, Belgium, Sweden, and England. After recognizing the growing army of working women across the world, she helped Clara Zetkin establish the first Working Women's Day on March 8, 1911. The date was chosen in recognition of women socialists of the USA, who held the first Women's Day 2 years prior by organizing large protests and marches across the country and demanding their political rights. At the International Socialist Conference of Women Workers in 1910, it was decided that every country should mark March 8th to annually celebrate Working Women's Day. In 1913, under the merciless power of the Tsar, Russian women organized the first Working Women's Day. It sparked a great outbreak of political activity from proletarian women. Articles were written and meetings were held everywhere. Small towns and villages packed their halls so full that many of the men had to give up their seats for their sister comrades. The rest of the men stayed home to look after the children, as their formerly captive housewives now attended public meetings. As the condition of proletarian women began improving in all directions, Kollontai's revolutionary activity became more urgent and her workload even heavier with Russia's entry into World War I. Kollontai was a pacifist and was deeply troubled with the widespread pro-war positions of social democratic parties across Europe, including the German Social Democrats, of whom she was a party member. She called for an immediate end to the war and fought growing militaristic tendencies by showing how the capitalist class manipulates the working class through national chauvinism. She sharply pointed out the contradictions in capitalist pro-war propaganda. The imperialists claim to fight wars to defend culture, but what kind of culture would participate in such horrific barbarism and bloodletting? The imperialists claim to fight wars in defense of the motherland, but unlike their landlords and generals, the propertyless workers and soldiers do not own the land. They have nothing to gain from the war. The imperialists speak of the honor in fighting in wars, but then why are the soldiers and veterans starved, mentally deranged, made unfit for work, and provided such meager government provision, hardly enough to cover the cost of the boot for their remaining leg? Her pamphlet, Who Wants War?, which was widely distributed among workers and frontline soldiers, declared in no uncertain terms that the capitalist class was responsible for and were the sole beneficiaries of the war. Her argument, which was solidly in line with Lenin's thesis on imperialism, stated that the ultimate cause of war was rooted in the growth of capital accumulation beyond the confines of the national economy. As the capitalist economy develops in each state, capital begins to feel cramped in its own country. In order to increase profits and interest, capital requires that the market expand, requires new places, countries, colonies into which it can invest its accumulated capitals, and from which the manufacturers and industrialists can obtain raw materials such as metal, ore, and cotton to produce goods. Capital clashes with capital, fights against capital, each seeking to expel the other. Each desires mastery for itself, to retain its monopoly. The more quickly capitalism develops, the more states are drawn into this struggle, the more bitter the struggle becomes. War becomes unavoidable. From this position, it logically followed that the resolution to end the World War and all future wars was not to rally the nation to defeat the enemy or pour greater pride and honor into the military, but to abolish the root problem of the global conflict itself. Wars will only end when the power of the capitalists has been smashed, when the owner-exploiters are no longer able to harm the people and push them into bloody conflicts. War is generated by the unjust, inequitable capitalist structure of society. In order to put an end to the war, the structure of society must be changed. The enemy is capitalism. The enemy is the rapacious, corrupt class government. This enemy is the lack of rights suffered by the working class. Comrade worker, a private in the enemy army, I know now that it is not you who are my enemy. After the First Russian Revolution of 1905, Kollontai eventually sided with the more diplomatic Menshevik Party, but Russia's entry into World War I disillusioned her in regards to what could be achieved through the Tsar's Duma. She decided to join the Bolshevik Party in 1915 because they were, in her words, those who most consistently fought social patriotism. She joined in Lenin's chorus for the proletarians of all countries to unite against the imperialist war and to turn their rifles and guns against their real common class enemies, the bourgeoisie. Lenin was unlike any man, any person Kollontai had ever met, and even before the February Revolution, spoke about him in an almost divine manner. There are individuals, a mere handful in the history of mankind, who, while themselves being the product of an imminent catastrophic change, leave their mark upon an entire epoch. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is one such mind, one such giant will. It is not a question of the personal characteristics of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, but what he symbolizes. He has gathered to himself like a magnet everything in the revolution that is expressive of will, power, ruthless destruction, and constructive persistence. Everyone who values what the workers' revolution brings with it, in its cleansing whirlwind, cannot but value and cherish its symbol, its embodiment, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Alone against the whole world, he pitilessly analyzed and laid bare the essence of imperialist war, and more importantly, clearly indicated the ways and means of transforming this war into civil war and revolution. Lenin sent Kollontai and her former lover Alexandra Kollontai on diplomatic missions to Sweden, but she was arrested, imprisoned, and expelled shortly after their arrival. With the help of Norwegian friends, she settled in a little red house outside of Oslo, Norway, where she turned out a number of writings. Two of these writings focused squarely on the issues of proletarian motherhood. Kollontai understood that the growth of capital required a growing population, which placed great pressure on women to produce the future proletarian generations. However, the capitalist mode of production also recruited greater amounts of labor power from the working class by bringing proletarian women into the production process. The burden of labor placed on them as workers in the factory often made motherhood impossible in the home. The ravages of toil and poverty placed working women in a situation that made them unfit to be attentive and caring mothers. Unlike bourgeois women, proletarian women experienced a bifurcation between their lives as workers and their lives as mothers. Kollontai understood that working mothers needed the support necessary to make motherhood a joy rather than a burden, and too often, a tragedy. She elaborated on this point by illustrating how the experience of pregnancy and childbirth differs between bourgeois and proletarian women. She introduces us to the director of a factory and patriarch of a small bourgeois household. She also introduces 4 women named Mansha from 4 different class backgrounds. One of the women is the factory director's wife, 2 of them are housemaids for the director, and another is an employee in the dye department of the director's factory. When the director's wife discovers she is pregnant, there is a festive atmosphere. The director will have an heir. She is given everything she needs to ensure the baby is healthy: medical attention, food, rest, comfort, etc. When the first housemaid also discovers herself pregnant, it comes with a flood of worry. She cannot let the director know she is pregnant. She cannot lose her job. She remains steady at work and keeps the pregnancy a secret. When she has finished her day of labor in the director's home, she returns to her own cold and wet dwelling, only to continue on with carrying out the domestic labor of her own household. While his wife is pregnant, the director takes a particular interest in the second housemaid. She is young, poor, and ignorant, and she too becomes pregnant. When the director's wife discovers this, she throws a scene, and the housemaid is fired. She is left to wander the streets looking for work, but no one will hire a pregnant woman. She has nowhere to go. She passes by a river. The dark waves terrify her, but at the same time seem to beckon. A worker in the director's dye department fainted and has been carried out of the factory. A male doctor inspects her and claims that it's absolutely nothing, and that pregnant women act in all sorts of strange ways. Upon regaining consciousness, she is guided back to her workstation and expected to carry on with her labor amid the dangerous fumes. She is having her baby soon and appeals to the director for time off. Business is doing well for the director, and he can afford to lose a pregnant worker. He refuses her request and responds, "If you didn't sleep with men, you wouldn't get pregnant." For the director's bourgeois wife, the birth is a celebratory event, aided by a flurry of doctors, midwives, relatives, and nurses. Her husband is by her side, flowers on the table, and a priest gives a prayer over her. She has everything she needs to welcome her newborn into the world. The first housemaid is also in labor. In the corner of a crowded room, surrounded by fellow workers trying to sleep, she buries her face in a pillow to muffle her screams of pain. Her husband is at work and cannot be present, but the midwife has just arrived from her last pregnancy. She washes and tucks the baby up before heading off to the next delivery. The housemaid weeps to herself silently and tries to gain some rest before heading back to work to nurse the director's newborn. The second housemaid, fired by the director, has still not found work. Out of desperation, she inquired at several maternity homes, but none would have her. She is forced to give birth in a back alley all by herself. She wraps the unwashed baby in a scarf and stumbles along looking for a place to go. She remembers the dark river, and in the morning, policemen drag a body from the water. The dye worker has a stillborn birth. She has inhaled far too much steam from the factory to nurture a healthy child in the womb. The birth was difficult, and she is lucky to be alive. But by the evening, she is back to cooking and cleaning. After all, who else will do it? She ignores the doctor's orders to rest for 9 days and returns to the factory the following day. In 1916, Russia had an extraordinarily high birth rate of approximately 50 live births per 1,000 people. But it also had a dreadfully high child mortality rate, with 35% of children dying within the first 5 years of birth. In some of the poorest areas of the Russian countryside, more than half of all newborns died within the first year of life. In urban proletarian communities, roughly 30% of children died before the age of 6. Millions of Russian children died annually from lack of basic life-sustaining necessities. The majority of these deaths were caused by poverty, lack of access to basic necessities, poor social hygiene, and consumption of rotten food. In bourgeois neighborhoods, where mothers and children had every need met, the child mortality rate dropped to only 8%. To elevate the level of proletarian motherhood care to the level of bourgeois mothers, Kollontai understood that it was necessary to implement a comprehensive set of social reforms akin to those introduced at the Copenhagen Resolution. Kollontai advocated for various short-term reforms such as labor laws for women, maternity insurance, maternity homes, nursing homes, universal medical care, children's centers, and kindergarten schools as de facto daycares. But she also advanced a long-term overall vision of society, where the state and collective play a major role in alleviating the burden of motherhood on working women. She wanted to extend the comfort, assistance, love, support, and care that bourgeois mothers receive to proletarian women as well, at first through the state, but eventually by society altogether. She argued that the state and society should assume partial responsibility for the upbringing and education of the youth, not only out of a sense of moral duty for proletarian mothers or the millions of children who needlessly perish every year, but for the benefit of the state and society itself. Children are not only future proletarians, taxpayers, and comrades, but also potential leaders and recruits for the state. During her period in exile from 1908 to 1916, she spoke at many venues across Europe and also undertook a 7-week speaking tour of the US. There, she sought to build support for the left Norwegian position on the war and find a publisher for her English translation of Lenin's pamphlet, Socialism and War. She also attended a memorial rally for Joe Hill in Seattle and spoke from the same platform as Eugene Debs in Chicago. In total, she spoke at 123 meetings in 4 different languages. Upon her trip to New York City, she wrote an interesting critique of American culture in her pamphlet, The Statue of Liberty. Even long after Kollontai had shaken the popular illusion of the US as the land of freedom, she was still taken aback by the extent to which the statue represented the cutthroat tendency of the US to subordinate all freedoms to the freedom of capital. I refuse to believe my eyes. Is that the Statue of Liberty? So tiny, lost in the noise of the harbor and framed against the soaring skyscrapers of the Wall Street banks. The outlines of the city, the huge, twisting, relentlessly upward thrusting lines of the New York skyscrapers, begin to blur. The Statue of Liberty has long since become a scarcely visible dot. It has disappeared. A little while longer, and America will lose reality for us, will become one of the images of the succession of life's memories.
So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race.
On March 8, 1917, proletarian Russian women marched on the streets of Petrograd to commemorate International Working Women's Day and demand bread for our children. Many soldiers had given up on the war effort, retreated from the front lines, and returned to Petrograd to support the women's protest and call an end to the war. Thousands of protesters surrounded the Winter Palace, shots were fired, and one of Kollontai's close friends was martyred in the bloodshed. By March 12th, many of the Tsarist police, garrison forces, and gendarmes put down their weapons. Many of them sided with the mass of demonstrators, while others simply gazed with bewilderment at the insurrectionary crowd. On March 26th, the last remaining garrison forces walked away from their duties. The Winter Palace was left completely unguarded, with a flood of insurrectionary forces outside and the Tsar's now defenseless family inside. Desperate to protect his family, the Tsar abdicated his throne and transferred his power to the provisional government, putting a halt to almost 300 years of Romanov rule over the Russian Empire. Kollontai heard the news from Russia and made her way back along with a flood of other political exiles. Upon her arrival, she notes the change of atmosphere in her homeland. A sleigh carried me across the river which marks the frontier. On Russian soil stood a soldier. The young officer helped me out of the sleigh and kissed my hand, almost reverently. I was standing on the Republican soil of liberated Russia. A few weeks after her arrival, she came into contact with Lenin's April theses, which argued that the February Revolution, while successful in overthrowing the Tsar and instituting a bourgeois government, was not the final stage of revolution. Lenin argued that the mass of class-conscious Russian workers gave rise to the potential for proletarian revolution, and that the revolution remained unfinished until socialism had been achieved. She ardently agreed with Lenin, and at the tumultuous gathering of Russian Social Democrats on April 4th, voted in support of Lenin's motion to dissolve the provisional government and demand all power to the Soviets. From April to November, she fought to push the socialist revolution on many fronts. She promoted Lenin's April theses, pressed for greater women's involvement in trade unions, led a citywide laundress workers' strike, and was arrested with several comrades in the July uprising against the provisional government. In September, the Bolshevik Central Committee held a decisive vote on whether to instigate armed insurrection. She was the sole member to vote alongside Lenin in favor of armed uprising, which quickly led to the October Revolution. There are memorable days in the life of mankind which run like a golden thread of popular celebration down the centuries. There are days which are equal to centuries in the history of humanity, and which proclaim that however cruelly the people may be oppressed by violence and arbitrary rule, the hour will come when a mighty, triumphant, indestructible force, the spirit of the fraternal unity of the workers in close alliance with the revolutionary will of the deprived masses, will overthrow the old, outworn order through a powerful upsurge of popular wrath, through the onslaught of democracy stirred into heroic rebellion. Kollontai was with Lenin as the revolutionary events unfolded, and when Lenin declared victory and transferred all power from the provisional government to the Soviets. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was unforgettable at that moment. His penetrating, energetic, and thoughtful gaze was fixed on the future. He saw that which we could not yet see, the future which we still had to attain. Lenin was calm, resolute. His instructions, his movements, had that clarity and force that one finds in a very experienced captain guiding his ship through a storm. And this storm was like no other, the storm of the Great Socialist Revolution. When Kollontai originally wrote of the condition of proletarian women and how to alleviate the burdens of their circumstance, her lofty ideals for the future were starkly contrasted against the realities of Russian society: excessive infant mortality, a high maternal death rate, and low life expectancy. But within a matter of months, Kollontai went from an underground activist working in exile to becoming one of the most politically significant women in the world, and found herself in the historic position of laying the foundation of a socialist state for working women. On October 26th, at the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, she was elected People's Commissar for Social Welfare, and she became the first woman cabinet member in the world's first ever socialist state. Today, as we bury the heroic victims of the revolution, the spring air is filled not only with songs of mourning for those who have fallen in the struggle for freedom, but also with the millions of voices of an exultant choir proclaiming the victory of the revolution. Our first task is to help our comrades build the new, democratic Russia. Our second task, no less urgent and closer to our hearts, is to rouse working women to declare war on war. This means uniting the forces of working women and men around that party, which not only defends the interests of the Russian proletariat, but is also fighting to ensure that proletarian blood is not shed for the glory of capitalists.
Товарищи работницы, долгие века женщина была угнетена и бесправна. Долгие века она была лишь придатком при мужчине, его тенью. Муж кормил жену, за это жена подчинялась его воле, покорно несла свое бесправие, свое домашнее и семейное рабство. Октябрьская революция раскрепостила женщину. Теперь у крестьянки такие же права, как и у крестьянина, у работницы такие же права, что у рабочего. Женщина всюду может выбирать, может быть членом совета и комиссаром, и даже народным комиссаром. Но если по закону женщина равноправна, то жизнь еще не раскрепостила женщину. Работница, крестьянка еще в кабале у домашнего хозяйства, еще рабыня в своей собственной семье. Задача рабочих сейчас наладить жизнь так, чтобы снять бремя, заботу о детях с плеч женщины, чтобы облегчить работницы и крестьянки кабалу домашнего хозяйства. Рабочий класс заинтересован в том, чтобы раскрепостить женщин, и в этих областях рабочий должен понимать, что женщина такой же член пролетарской семьи, как и он сам. Ведь женщина трудится наравне с мужчиной. Треть всех богатств на земле созданы руками женщин. В Европе и Америке числится 70 миллионов работниц. В коммунистическом обществе женщина и мужчина должны быть равноправны. Без равноправия женщин нет коммунизма. На работу же, товарищи работницы, беритесь за свое раскрепощение. Стройте ясли, дома, материнства, помогите советам налаживать общественные столовые, помогите коммунистической партии построить новую светлую жизнь. Ваше место в рядах тех, кто борется за раскрепощение трудящихся, за равенство, за свободу, за счастье ваших детей. Ваше место работницы-крестьянки под красным революционным знаменем мирового победного коммунизма.
The sense of urgency that drove her to resolve the dire problems facing Russia was reflected in the tremendous amount she accomplished in her short tenure as commissar from October 1917 to March 1918. Under her direction, the commissariat applied many of her ready ideas into a number of social programs, including a pension system for retirees, care homes for the aged, daycare for children, homeless shelters and hospitals for the needy, including orphan children, as well as provisions for disabled war veterans, such as the manufacture of artificial limbs. It also abolished the church monopoly on educating young girls by establishing a public school system and recruiting priests into the civil service. She also helped Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, and Lenin's friend, Ineza Armand, establish Rabotnitsa, a party newspaper tailored to a proletarian woman audience. By Kollontai's own account, the most important achievement of the People's Commissariat was the construction of a legal framework that laid the foundation for the enshrinement of maternity rights. The Central Office for Maternity and Infant Welfare changed all maternity hospitals into free homes for maternity and infant care, and set the groundwork for a comprehensive public system of prenatal care. She declared that the utmost priority was to lower the infant mortality rate by lightening the burden of motherhood. 2 million young lives were yearly dwindling in Russia because of the darkness of the oppressed people, because of apathy of the class state. 2 million suffering mothers were saturating yearly the Russian earth with tears, and were covering with their blistered hands the early graves of the innocent victims of the hideous social order. All these horrors of a nightmare have fortunately sunk into the dark mist of the past since the victory of the workers and peasants. A morning bright and pure for the children themselves has come. The People's Commissariat for Social Welfare ordered a decree for medical services for expectant mothers to be organized on the basis of 3 new principles. Number 1. Medical assistance needs to be made available to all mothers, including the poorest workers and peasants. Number 2. Doctors need to be paid a state salary and equalize the medical treatment of proletarian women to bourgeois women. Number 3. Poor women, on whom unskilled midwives and medical students hone their medical knowledge, will no longer be sacrificed to such scientific experiments. Medical students will be required to take more in-depth education and training before becoming qualified to deliver newborns. Here again, she was closely in line with Lenin and admired him deeply for his support in the cause of proletarian women, an issue he often inquired about and a position he sometimes had to defend in the face of ridicule and male chauvinism. Vladimir Ilyich believed that women should be given the possibility of working in the state apparatus while simultaneously being able to be mothers. Women are a valuable creative force, but they also have the right and duty to be mothers. Motherhood is a major social obligation. Our Soviet state is implementing to the full these basic propositions put forward by Vladimir Ilyich. Not only the women of the Soviet Union, but women throughout the world should know that Vladimir Ilyich laid the foundations of female emancipation. Nowhere in the world, nowhere in history is there such a thinker and statesman who has done so much for the emancipation of women as Vladimir Ilyich. In March 1918, she resigned from her position as People's Commissar in protest of the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty between the Bolsheviks and Germans. The treaty allowed Russia to finally pull from the World War, but it also sacrificed the Ukraine to Germany. Former allies perceived the treaty as a desertion, and immediately after, French, British, and US forces invaded Russia. The Bolsheviks had previously promised an end to war for the Russian workers and peasants, but now the civil war began. War was on the home front, and bloodshed became unavoidable. Kollontai was forced, once again, to turn her focus towards anti-imperialism. The imperialist predators are not afraid of blood and place no value on human life. They needed war, and therefore the bourgeoisie of every country mounted repeated attacks upon Soviet Russia and the Soviet Ukraine. A new battlefront took shape, not Russians against Germans or Ukrainians against the Allies, but Reds against Whites, the working people against the bourgeoisie. We are fighting in order to defend the right of the workers and peasants to run their own homeland. We are fighting in order to protect the people against the possible return of famine and rising prices. We are fighting in order to create one united international fraternal republic of workers and peasants, destroy private property owners and the predatory rich, and thus put an end to the war once and for all. Long live peaceful, productive labor on behalf of all working people. Although Kollontai was afflicted by a heart attack, kidney disease, and typhus throughout 1919, she nonetheless kept up with a demanding schedule of meetings, speeches, and writings. She served as a delegate to the First Congress of the Communist International, president of the political department of the Crimean Republic, commissar of propaganda and agitation for the Ukraine, and co-founded the women's section of the Communist Party, which sought to educate women on their rights as workers, wives, and mothers, and introduced a massive literacy campaign. She recognized that with the abolition of capital and private property in Russia, the floodgates of revolutionary change for women were widely opening in all directions. Proletarian women now had equal rights with men, were now capable to seek a divorce, permitted to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, and were protected from harmful labor. Kollontai saw that these steps were quickly elevating Russia from the lower to higher stage of communism, where it is fully understood by all members of society that child-rearing was not an individual but a social obligation. The Labor Republic must therefore provide the pregnant woman with the most favorable possible conditions, and the woman, for her part, must observe all the rules of hygiene during her pregnancy, remembering that in these months she no longer belongs to herself. She is serving the collective, producing from her own flesh and blood a new unit of labor, a new member of the Labor Republic. There have been instances where a mother, even a communist mother, refuses to breastfeed a baby that is suffering from a lack of milk, only because it is not her baby. Future society, with its communist emotion and understanding, will be as amazed at such egotistic and antisocial acts as we are when we read of women in prehistoric society who loved their own child but found the appetite to eat the child of another tribe. Soviet power tries to create a situation where a woman alone does not have to fear for her life and the life of her child. She emphasized how the greatest level of this transformation will be a change of social consciousness, moving away from bourgeois morality to communist morality. For Kollontai, one of the most important indicators and measurements of this moral progress was in the prevalence of prostitution. The ultimate problem with prostitution, and the problem which largely guided Kollontai towards treating the issue with such attention, was that it represented an expression of the old bourgeois morality still persistent in Soviet society. Under capitalism, women's survival is dependent on them selling their bodies to men, as wives, laborers, or as prostitutes. Therefore, the degree to which prostitution persisted in Soviet society was a reflection of women's continued dependency on men, and an indication of work yet to be done. She criticized bourgeois thinkers for diagnosing prostitution as a pathological affliction rooted in some innate feature of the woman, and pointed out that prostitution is a social phenomenon rooted in the economic structure of society. She shows how prostitution in capitalist societies becomes a profession and an entire industry, recruiting more women into the ranks of selling their bodies for sex than any other epoch of human history. The roots of prostitution are in economics. Woman is on the one hand placed in an economically vulnerable position, and on the other hand has been conditioned by centuries of education to expect material favors from a man in return for sexual favors, whether these are given within or outside the marriage tie. This is the root of the problem. She shows how prostitution directly emerged from private property relations that govern both a woman's position in the workforce as well as her sexual relation to men. The capitalist mode of production not only turns the body of the worker into the property and tool of the capitalist, but proletarian women become the property and tool of bourgeois men, who use their disposable income to purchase their bodies for work in the factory, home, or the brothel. She further demonstrates the economic roots of prostitution by showing that almost all prostitutes are poor women from the lower classes of society, and points out how the profession suddenly booms under periods of economic crisis and unemployment. She draws attention to various related social problems, such as the spread of venereal diseases, child exploitation, as well as prostitution as a source of orphan children. But for Kollontai, prostitution was a deeper problem because it deformed society's concept of love. Commercializing sex, the act of lovemaking, renders sexual relations mere exchange relations, based not in mutual love and respect between partners, but egotistic self-gain. She argued that such a relationship between the sexes hindered the emancipation of women from the dated morality of bourgeois society, and prevented the cultivation of comradely love in the new socialist epoch. She strongly believed that communist society would be based on a collective morality of love that was extended from all members of society to all members of society. It would do away with the bourgeois morality of individualism that compartmentalizes love as a property relation between two individuals, and hindered its extension to the collective. What could be more monstrous than the act of love reduced to the level of a profession? Nothing so empties the human soul as the buying of physical love from a stranger, or the selling of love in this way. Prostitution extinguishes the love in people's hearts, and deforms a normal attitude towards sex. It cripples and impoverishes the spirit. It cuts out and takes away what is most valuable, the ability to feel the passion and love that extend and enrich the individual by giving him a store of emotional experience. Prostitution distorts our understanding, and the mutual misunderstanding of the sexes grows. She not only drew comparisons between prostitutes and bourgeois housewives in terms of their economic dependency on men, but further argued that prostitutes, like bourgeois housewives, were leeches on the productive sectors of the economy. They were unproductive workers whose activity only took from but did not contribute to the improvement of the whole. For Kollontai, recruiting prostitutes into the ranks of the Soviet proletariat therefore provided a twofold solution to the root problem. Not only did it liberate women from their economic dependency on men, but it also redirected their labor power for the betterment of themselves and those around them. Comrades, our task is to cut out the roots that feed prostitution. Our task is to wage a merciless struggle against all the remnants of individualism and of the former type of marriage. Our task is to revolutionize attitudes in the sphere of sexual relationships, to bring them into line with the interests of the working collective. Kollontai's thought was a powerful mix between the lofty idealism of a future communist society and practical implementation. The achievements made in the well-being of women, children, and families throughout the early years of the revolution provided strong justification for Kollontai's boundless optimism. She saw the grand advancements made by women as democratizing basic necessities for the proletariat and empowering it as a class. However, when she turned her focus towards party politics, she perceived a troublesome and growing tendency among its official ranks that were heading the party in the opposite direction. At the early stages of revolution, land ownership was abolished, peasants seized and redistributed the land, the Soviets pulled from the war, and the proletarian uprisings in Europe held promise for international revolution. But shortly after, civil war, food shortages, as well as economic and social instability gave rise to the policies of war communism. The Civil War prompted centralized control over industry and the trade unions, and many of the earlier policies favored by the workers and peasants were reversed. Kollontai argued that war communism, and later the new economic policy, represented a growing bureaucratic tendency within the Bolshevik Party. She sought to combat this tendency by arguing that it was undermining the original ideals of the revolution, which sought to give rise to a dictatorship of the proletariat, not a party bureaucracy that was dissociated from and stood above the workers. She cited Marx and Engels' proclamation that socialist revolution must be carried out and to the benefit of the workers themselves. In 1920, a quasi-syndicalist group formed a faction within the Bolshevik Party and was given the title Workers' Opposition. In 1921, Kollontai wrote a lengthy pamphlet which articulated the concerns of the workers' opposition. She argued that an infiltration of petty bourgeois and other non-proletarian elements into the Bolshevik Party were transforming it into an overly bloated anti-democratic structure, a complete negation of a self-directed workers' state. She identified how the party bureaucracy offered petty privileges and benefits to bureaucrats, but not to the average worker, how it relied more on appointments rather than elections for public posts, how it continued to lean on repressive rather than restorative policies, and how directions were handed down by centralized authorities rather than initiated by the workers themselves. But perhaps most importantly, she protested against how the party stifled critical discourse, particularly self-criticism coming from the party itself. She held firmly to the idea that in order to correct errors and past mistakes, it was imperative that the workers and party members felt free to openly disagree and criticize the direction of the party. She reasoned that a workers' state would be built in the interest of the workers themselves, but since this wasn't the case, there must have been elements within the state opposed to building socialism and hindering its development. Some of the highest ranks of the military and industry were occupied by specialists and experts who had previous experience in these positions, but many also held loyalties to entities other than the Bolsheviks. Her solution was to purge all non-proletarian elements that were preventing trade unions from gaining greater control over industry. She argued that workers should elect party officials from the ground up, rather than officials delegating orders from the top down. Greater democratic participation by the workforce would ensure that the party implements its policies and programs with the long-term goal of reaching the higher stage of communism. Her pamphlet was immediately printed in English, distributed in the US, and was received by foreign audiences with great interest. It took pointed aim at the Bolshevik Party and revealed the inner tensions of the party machinery that were not always visible to the outside observer. What are the party leaders doing? Do they attempt to find the cause of the evil? Do they openly admit that their very system, which was carried out into life through the Soviets, paralyzes and deadens the masses, though it was meant to encourage their initiative? No, our party leaders do nothing of the kind, just the opposite. Instead of finding means to encourage the mass initiative, which could fit perfectly into our flexible Soviet institutions, our party leaders all of a sudden appear in the role of defenders and knights of bureaucracy. When she published the pamphlet in the state newspaper Pravda and circulated it to members of the party Congress in March, it was met with much skepticism among her comrades. When Lenin was given a copy of her pamphlet, he immediately castigated her, claiming she had written the platform of a new party. He not only threatened to submit her pamphlet to the court of the Comintern, but also said directly to her, "For this you should not only be excluded from the party, but shot as well." The Party Congress issued 2 last-minute resolutions on March 16th, the Anarchist-Syndicalist Deviation in Our Party and On Party Unity. The first identified the program of the workers' opposition to be incompatible with Marxism, communism, or the party platform. And the second declared the end of factionalism within the party. Opposition and criticism would be welcomed, but once a final decision had been made, conformity to the party line was obligatory. The resolutions were an overt effort to repress the workers' opposition. Kollontai was sidelined, and support among the workforce dramatically declined. Perhaps it wasn't obvious to her at the time, but in hindsight it seems odd that Kollontai was not more receptive to the potential consequences of introducing her syndicalist ideas to the party. Her critique of the Bolshevik Party was characteristic of critiques that are often advanced towards Stalin as a personality. But she pointed out well before Stalin became General Secretary in 1922 that the threat of bureaucratization, militarization, and authoritarian tendencies were already present under the vanguard party of Lenin. She advanced an untimely criticism, which was not only unfit for the economic and military circumstances, but unwelcome to the bureaucrats eager to maintain their control over the direction of the revolution through the state. The Letter of 22, signed by herself and other members of the workers' opposition, was her final act of resistance against bureaucratization of the party. It appealed to the Comintern against the growing rigidity of party hierarchy. At the 4th Congress of the Comintern, Trotsky prevented her from speaking and issued a decree through the Central Committee for all members of the Russian delegation to obey the directives of the party. Shortly after, as Stalin became General Secretary, he suggested that Kollontai be expelled from the party for her stance with the workers' opposition. Kollontai was deeply shaken by the nightmare of being ejected from the party. She promised to no longer pose a threat to the party, and even pledged her unwavering support to the state to avoid disciplinary action. Stalin was in charge of assigning certain party positions, and she wrote to him asking for a foreign post. He agreed, and she was appointed to advise the Soviet delegation in Norway, which became a sort of de facto exile from the Soviet Union. By this point, she had divorced with her second husband, and therefore resettled in Norway by herself. Her writing sharply declined, not only in quantity, but noticeably in quality as well. She no longer generated fresh, new ideas, and no longer wrote with the same enthusiasm that shined through her earlier writings. From 1922 onwards, her works were mostly characterized by reflections on the early years of the revolution, and completely resigned from any criticism of the party. In 1926, when a publisher had approached her for a manuscript of her autobiography, she was embarrassed and apologetic for submitting such a sanitized account of her life to avoid the attention of Soviet censors. From 1926 onward, many of the policies introduced under Kollontai, including a woman's right to an abortion, had been reversed. The economic situation and the overriding focus on industrialization required the curtailment of social spending on sectors of the economy seen as unproductive, which in this period included the labor of mothers and housewives. But the dismantling of much of Kollontai's work proceeded without any protest from her. But by 1927, Kollontai herself had, as it were, finally aligned herself once and for all with the Stalinists. Everything's changed so much. What can I do about this? One cannot go against the apparatus. For my part, I have put my principles aside in a corner of my conscience, and I pursue as best I can the policies they dictate to me. The masses do not believe in opposition. They greet every statement of the opposition with smiles. Is it possible that the opposition thinks the masses' memory is so short? If they come across defects in the party, in the political line, who, if not the famous members of the opposition, established them and built them? It seems that the policy of the party and the structure of the apparatus become unfit only from the day that a group of oppositionists breaks with the party. She was even forced to maintain this silent and uncritical stance towards the party as her old Bolshevik comrades, including her former lover as well as ex-husband, were executed under Stalin's purges. One of her close friends revealed that in a private conversation, Kollontai, holding back tears, reflected on the execution of her close comrades, including her physician, who she was deeply saddened by. As she gazed up at the large icicles hanging nearby, she solemnly said, "There was a time when all our men seemed as straight and firm and pure as these. Life confronts us with many things that are difficult to understand." Nevertheless, she took to her new post with great pride. After her position as ambassador to Norway, she became a trade delegate to Mexico, a Soviet delegate to the League of Nations, ambassador to Sweden, and a negotiator in the Finno-Soviet peace treaty. She also played a major role in keeping Sweden neutral during the war. From 1933 to 1944, she was also awarded 4 of the highest honorary awards from the Soviet Union, Norway, and Mexico, including the Order of Lenin, the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, the Knight's Grand Cross of the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olav, and Order of the Aztec Eagle. And her efforts in negotiating a peaceful agreement between Finland and the Soviet Union earned her 2 nominations for a Nobel Peace Prize. From 1946 onward, she advised the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs, until March 9, 1952, when she passed away in Moscow, less than a month before her 80th birthday. Stalin, Muranov, and herself were the only members of the Bolshevik Central Committee during the revolution to survive until the 1950s. Kollontai's intelligence, foresight, and unflinching determination for revolution led her to support 3 critical but unpopular positions taken by Lenin when even most of her Bolshevik comrades were opposed: the call for an immediate end to the war, the call for socialist revolution, and a call for a coup d'etat. Upon Bolshevik capture of state power, Kollontai found herself shifting from lofty ideals and prospects for the future to implementing these ideals into practice. Even though she frequently commented on how very little had been achieved in relation to what was yet to be done, her legacy rests on the colossal changes she was able to bring to proletarian women in Soviet society. Under the Bolsheviks, Russia was among the first countries in the world to recognize the rights of women and children. Maternity rights, including the right to abortion and divorce, were introduced in Russia on a more comprehensive scale than anywhere else in the world, and inspired many reforms in the capitalist West. It is in large part due to her tireless effort that the legitimacy of the Soviet government quickly spread not only among the Soviet proletariat, but foreign countries as well. In 1922, Kollontai wrote a charming narrative about a commune gathering of young and old comrades in the year 1970 on what used to be called Christmas Day. Organized in the most rational way, the commune took good care of everyone and had no enemies because all the neighboring communes had been organized in a similar fashion. The commune ensured that everyone had ample time for relaxation and self-care. Members were required to work 2 hours a day, but were free to spend leisure time in whatever capacity they chose, whether artistic, intellectual, or any other way. There was no rich, there was no poor. Everyone shared equally in the labor of society, and everyone shared equally in the fruits of social labor. One only needed to take a glance at the firm, healthy, happy faces of the young children to see how much they differed from the young people on the barricades, who had lived under the yoke of capitalism. Children of the commune urged the old veterans to tell them about their childhood, about the revolution, and about Lenin. But the grandparents struggled to find the words to describe to these children, who had never known war or material deprivation, what the revolution was like. "Granddad, I know what the word capitalist means," boasted a lively lad who was tucking into the special holiday pie. "And I know what a ruble is, and what money is. We saw money in a museum. Did you have money, Granddad? Did you carry it in a little bag in your pocket?" And then there were people. Now, what were they called? Thieves. That's right, isn't it? And they took money out of the pockets of their comrades? How very strange it must have been. And they all laughed at the strange past. Did you actually shoot people? Shoot at living people? The eyes of the young people showed surprise and sparked with reproach and bewilderment. Life was sacred to them. They could not comprehend such barbarism. "We sacrificed everything for the revolution," Red Grandmother said in justification. "And hunger? You went hungry? You must have been very unorganized and ignorant." Ignorant, unorganized, The young people could pass no sterner judgment on Red Grandmother's contemporaries. "Grandmother, Red Grandmother, tell us about Lenin. You saw him, didn't you? Did he live like everyone else? Did he eat and drink and laugh? Did Lenin ever look at the stars, Grandmother?" Red Grandmother fell silent. What had the stars got to do with it? These young people had their own way of looking at everything. When Lenin was alive, there had been so much to do on the earth itself. There had been hunger and exhaustion, war and hunger, hunger and war, a time of suffering and bloodshed, but also of bravery, self-sacrifice, and heroism, and of tremendous faith in the victory of the revolution and the justice of the struggle. They simply could not understand the grandeur of the old struggles. But life had forged ahead. The great years were now only history. The social question was settled. The ideas of communism had justified themselves. Mankind was free from the slavery of backbreaking work for others, from material dependence, and from the struggle for daily bread. The young people held their heads high, facing the future boldly. They turned their eyes to the stars and said, "You achieved your aims, and we will achieve ours." Although the 1970s did not achieve the higher stage of communism imagined by Kollontai, it did see a resurgence of feminism, which recovered and popularized much of Kollontai's work for a contemporary audience. As feminist concepts like pink collar work, domestic labor, expressive roles, and the second shift were forcefully entering the public lexicon, Kollontai was one of the great beacons of the past used to articulate these concerns. In the 21st century, Alexandra Kollontai approaches us as a familiar figure. Much of the world continues to live under the social institutions and programs pioneered in her mind. And for many, it is impossible to imagine living without the public services taken for granted today. But she also appears to us as a somewhat unfamiliar figure. Her personal relationships, as well as her philosophy of love, the family, and communism, often come across, even to the modern reader, as radical and far-reaching. While much may have been achieved since the time of Kollontai, an overall bourgeois morality of love continues to plague much of the world. For some, Kollontai's legacy has fulfilled its purpose, and her more radical ideas such as free love and the communal family are misguided ideals informed by a distant and backward past. But for others, they are reminders of the areas of Kollontai's vision that have yet to be realized.
So